On January 21, 1793, a man stood on a wooden platform in the heart of Paris, holding the severed head of King Louis XVI for a screaming crowd to see. That man was not a revolutionary leader or a political firebrand. He was Charles-Henri Sanson, a man who spent his life trapped in a profession he detested, eventually becoming the most prolific executioner in human history. To understand the man known as the Great Sanson, you must first understand the shadow into which he was born. In 18th century France, the office of the executioner, or the Monsieur de Paris, was a hereditary curse. If your father carried the blade, you would carry the blade. There was no choice, no career path, and no escape. The Sansons were a dynasty of death, and Charles-Henri was the fourth generation to hold the title. The family lived a life of strange, wealthy isolation. Because they were considered untouchable, literally unclean by the standards of the church and society, they were forced to live outside the city walls. They could not marry into normal families, so executioner families married other executioner families, creating a small, grim aristocracy of outcasts. Despite the blood on their hands, the Sansons were surprisingly cultured. They were educated, wealthy, and refined. Charles-Henri himself grew up playing the violin and the cello, studying anatomy, and dressing in the finest silks. He was a gentleman in every sense of the word, except for the fact that his touch was considered a death sentence.
When Charles-Henri was just a young boy, he was sent away to school. But when the parents of the other students discovered who his father was, he was expelled to protect the school's reputation. This rejection defined his youth. He was a man who wanted to be a doctor, a man who spent his free time studying the healing arts, yet he was destined to be the man who ended lives rather than saved them. He officially took up the mantle of high executioner at the age of 39, following the stroke of his father. From that moment on, his life belonged to the state and the heavy red machinery of justice.
For the first decade of his career, Sanson performed executions in the traditional, brutal manner of the old regime. This meant hangings for commoners and beheadings with a sword for the nobility, but it also meant much worse. In 1757, as an assistant to his father, he participated in the execution of Robert François d'Amiens, who had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV. The execution lasted for hours, involving red-hot pincers and horses pulling the man apart. It was a spectacle of such extreme cruelty that it reportedly haunted Charles-Henri for the rest of his life. It was this specific horror that made him one of the strongest advocates for a more humane method of killing. When the French Revolution began to simmer in 1789, the nature of Sanson's work changed forever. A physician named Joseph-Ignace Guillotine proposed a machine that would decapitate the condemned painlessly and instantly, regardless of their social standing. Sanson, ever the professional, was consulted on the design. He argued that the traditional sword was unreliable, it dulled quickly, and the executioner's nerves could fail, leading to messy, botched jobs. He helped test the new device on sheep and then on human corpses at the Bicêtre hospital. He advocated for the slanted blade, which sliced rather than crushed. When the guillotine was finally perfected, Charles-Henri Sanson became its primary operator. He called it the national razor. Then came the year that would define his legacy and haunt his soul, 1793. The revolution had turned radical, the monarchy had fallen, and the King of France, Louis XVI, the man Sanson had sworn an oath of loyalty to as a royal official, was sentenced to death.
The morning of the king's execution was cold and foggy. Sanson arrived early, dressed in a black coat. History tells us that as the king was led to the scaffold, he remained remarkably calm. Louis XVI spoke to the crowd, pardoning those who were putting him to death. When the king's hair was cut to clear the neck, Sanson recorded in his diary that he felt a profound sense of grief. He was a monarchist at heart, a man who believed in the divine right of kings, yet he was the one who had to pull the lever. When the blade fell, Sanson did his duty, but he refused to participate in the jeering. He was a professional. even when his heart was breaking.
The death of the king was only the beginning. As the reign of terror took hold under Maximilien Robespierre, the pace of executions became frenetic. Sanson and his assistants were killing dozens of people every single day. The Monsieur de Paris was no longer just an executioner. He was an industrialist of death. He would wake up, check his lists, and spend the entire day at the scaffold until his clothes were soaked in blood and his arms were leaden with fatigue.
In October of 1793, he executed Queen Marie Antoinette. Unlike her husband, she was treated with utter contempt by the Revolutionary Guards, but Sanson maintained his professional distance. There is a famous story that as she stepped onto the scaffold, she accidentally trod on Sanson's foot. Her last words were whispered to him, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." He bowed to her, a final gesture of the old world's chivalry, before sending her to the blade.
The toll of the terror on Sanson's mental health was immense. He was a man who loved his garden and his music, yet he was surrounded by the stench of the pits where the bodies were dumped. He saw the greatest minds of France, from the scientist Lavoisier to the revolutionary Danton, pass through his hands. Danton's final words to him were famously, "Show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." Eventually, the revolution began to eat its own. In July 1794, the man who had orchestrated the terror, Robespierre himself, was brought to the scaffold. Sanson, who had seen so much blood that he was reportedly close to a breakdown, was the one who ended the terror by executing the architect of it. With Robespierre's head in the basket, the fever of the revolution finally broke.
Charles-Henri Sanson eventually retired, handing the office down to his son, Henri. He had performed nearly 3,000 executions in his career. He spent his final years in quiet anonymity, often seen walking through his gardens or attending Mass. There is an unconfirmed but fascinating story that he once met Napoleon Bonaparte. The emperor supposedly asked Sanson how he could sleep at night after killing so many people. Sanson's reply was sharp and haunting. If emperors, kings, and dictators can sleep, why shouldn't an executioner?
He died in 1806, leaving behind a legacy that is impossible to disentangle from the birth of modern France. He was a man of contradictions, a healer who was forced to kill, a royalist who beheaded his king, and a man who sought to make death more humane through the use of a machine. He was the silent witness to the most turbulent era in history, the man who held the blade while the old world died and the new one was born in a spray of crimson.
The Sanson dynasty finally ended in 1847 when Charles-Henri's grandson, Clement Henri, was forced to pawn the family's guillotine to pay off gambling debts, leading to his dismissal. But it is Charles-Henri who remains the central figure of this dark history. He wasn't a monster. He was a man caught in the gears of a machine he couldn't stop, doing a job that no one wanted but everyone demanded. He was the executioner of Paris, the man who ended the line of kings and became the ultimate symbol of the price of revolution. If you want to dive deeper into the darkest corners of history, make sure to subscribe.